Welcome back. In this video, I finally pull the engine out of this bike, strip it down, and find out what that rattle was all about. So first just take off the seat and the tank, and then I take the exhaust off and pretty much strip it right down. So if you're going to take the engine out, don't forget drain the oil. Obviously you don't need to do this, but if you don't, it's quite messy afterwards. So there's about 2.5 litres of oil in these engines. Then I just take the coils out. I removed the wiring loom earlier, so most of that was out of the way. Uh, this engine is quite heavy. Now, there's no doubt you could lift it out with a couple of people, but what I'm intending to do, given that I'm doing a complete build, is I'm stripping out everything I need to. Then I'm going to remove the front wheel and the rear wheel, and then basically lift the frame off the engine, which is a much easier way. If you need to take an engine out of your XJ, you don't have to do it that way. Obviously, you probably wouldn't if all you wanted to do was the engine, but it is a bit more work. You'd have to have at least a couple of people to lift it out. So just undoing the rear drive axle, there's 4 bolts in there. Turn the rear wheel around just so they line up in the right spot, and then there's these 2 bolts on the swing arm, so they don't go that far in. There's one on each side. Take them off, and then at that point you're pretty much ready to just pull the swing arm right off and out the way, and then all that'll be left will be the drive flange on the engine. These are quite tight. Can't remember now the socket size. 20 something mil, don't know. So once I get to this point, this is basically ready, so you can see how far I've pulled it down. Taking the horn out makes it easier. You do need to take the oil cooler off, that oil cooler bracket that just goes there. You do need to remove the oil filter, not just the front case, but the second casing, which is a big nut in there. You need to undo to pull that out of the way. Foot pegs need to come off. Starter motor can stay in. Undo the drive mechanism. Loosen these off so they're ready to pull out once I get it outside, and it should lift out fairly easily. So at this point I wheel it outside and take the swing arm out firstly. So just remove the 2 bolts from either side. That just pulls straight out, and you can obviously lift the frame off with the front and rear rims on, which I tried to do on the old police bike, and I did, but it's just a lot heavier with the rear wheel and the front. So as I said, given I'm pulling this right down, it's just easier to make it lighter, so I'm only lifting off a quite light frame once I've done all this. So I just took off the handlebars, undo the triple tree, pull that out, and there's the front end out of the way. So at this point, pretty much got a frame bare just with the engine. Take the bolts, the mounting bolts out from the right side, lay it down, and then once it's down there, I just remove the remaining mounting bolts. So there's a number of bolts around there, and there's a couple at the front here, there's one a bit lower down, and there's bolts that are connected to the foot pegs that are actually holding the engine as well. So just get these ones out, and it's pretty much ready at this point. And there's also this exhaust bracket that you do have to get off. Last bolt coming out, and the rear of the engine actually sits inside the foot peg mounts. So what I do is I just get like a bar just to pull the base of the engine up slightly, and then once it's out of there, you can see you do need to lift it relatively square. So there it is, pulled out, and then get the frame on the right angle, and it simply lifts off. And I think that's a much easier way to get the engine out of this bike. Just lift it up here, and then at this point I'm ready to start stripping it down to find out what's really gone on with this engine. If you remember way back in the first video. It had a nasty rattle, and I don't really know what was causing that. So I thought I'd just strip it down and see what's going on with it. So I want to convert this engine to a YX version. So this head here is actually off a XJ650. And here's the 750 engine out of the police bike. So I've got the crank I want to use out of that. And there is the barrels and the head out of the 750. So that head's a bit worn down. So I purchased that third one. And this is the old XJ650 I had, which is an identical engine to what I've started with. And between all of this, I've got a whole stack of parts. I should be able to build one really nice engine. And internally, this engine here looks quite good. So I take the rocker cover off first, and first thing I thought was maybe the timing chain is loose or stretched. So I take the cover off, and you know what? It actually looks pretty good. I'll give the chain a quick check. It's tensioned up properly. The cams look really good. It's had fresh oil in it. There's really no problem in terms of oil supply or seizing of the cams or anything like that. So it's all good. Certainly the rattle in this engine has not come about from the cam chain. So just take out the chain tensioner, and once that's out, I remove the cams, and once the cams are out of the way, put the valve cover back on, and then I'll undo the head bolts and be at a point where I can lift the head off. So I just undo the head bolts here. There are 10 head bolts. Once they're off, pry that up and off, and it comes off complete. And you can see the head gasket there. So looking at this, this is the first thing I find is that it's literally a new head gasket. So this engine has been pulled apart sometime recent. The gasket is literally new. So what I suspect happened is they probably heard the rattle, tried to fix it, put the head gasket on, thinking it might have been the chain, cam chain, and obviously it's not that. So just looking at the YX head and the non-YX head. So on the right there is the 750 head I plan to swap over. And you can see the difference is those ports on the left-hand side. There's 4 ports for the YX, which is part of the induction system. And there's a little difference in the middle section too. You see that rectangular hole has 4 bolts on the YX, and the non-YX there's just 2 bolts. So now obviously if you want to convert to YX, as far as I can see you can, but you cannot use the head and the barrels from a YX and non-YX. So if you want to go YX, the head and barrel needs to be matched, and it should bolt up to the original crankcase block. The measurements look the same. I can't see any reason why I can't swap the 750 YX onto this XJ650. So now I want to take the barrels off. Don't forget there's this one nut that needs to come out of the way. These can be a bit tight to get off, so a bit of persuasion, a bit of a tap with a hammer, and it lifts off. So previously this engine, as I say, the head gasket was replaced. This barrel has never been off. So a bit of fiddling around, and it eventually comes off, and it's in reasonable condition, these barrels. So those barrels there, obviously the 650 I'm not going to use. I'm going to use the barrels off the 750. So I'll take a few more measurements. Firstly, measuring up the bores on the 750, which come out at 65 millimeters, and then the bores on the 650 are 2 millimeters smaller at 63. So what I then wanted to check was the bore cylinder sleeves, just to see the size of those and were they any different. So when I measured them, the 750 was 71.3 mil and the 650 is 69.3. So I was thinking maybe it wouldn't fit into the crankcase, but as it turns out, the hole in the crankcase on a 650 is big enough to fit the bigger sleeves from a 750. So next thing I do is remove the starter motor. So simply just 2 10mm bolts, and it pries out Very simple, and it's got a gear on the end there, and there's another gear internally. Now, before we can split the crankcase covers, you need to take this final drive out. So there's 4 bolts, and there's a couple of bolts on top of the casing, as you can see here. So there's 4, 2 there that are 10 mil, and the front one's a 12 mil. You need to loosen those off a bit just to allow this sleeve to come out. So just slightly tap it out. It's just got a transition fit through a bearing, and it just comes out no problem. So that's the final drive out the way. From here, I start pulling off the side covers, and one side's got the crank sensor on it, so that's just an Allen key. That is not a left-hand thread, if you're wondering. Couple of decent Phillip head screws here, get them out the way, and then the timing gear just pulls off. So that's all pretty straightforward. And get that put aside. And then I take the clutch cover off. Again, pretty straightforward. And then tip the engine over, remove the sump. And at this point, I still don't know what the rattle is. So take all these bolts out. Have a look what's going on inside here. And when I get the sump off, it's not too bad. You know, there's a bit of gunk in the bottom, but it's not as bad as what I thought. Now, once I get the sump off, I finally find what the problem is, and it's this primary chain, and you can see how slack it is. Now, what that does, that drives the alternator, and it's also the starter motor drive to the crank to get the engine started. I'm not really sure what's caused that to stretch so much, whether the chain's stretched or whether there's something wrong with the guide, but I will have to have a look at that closely a bit later. But there is no doubt in my mind that is the rattle. And if you have a rattle like that, unfortunately changing that guide is a complete engine build. It's right deep inside the engine. You basically need the engine completely pulled apart to get to it. So at this point, you know, I take the rest of the crank casing bolts out, and I'm at a point where I am nearly ready to split this crank case open and just see what else I find internally. The final drive gear into the engine has these 4 bolts in them. They're torque bolts, and they need to be removed before you can split the crankcase. So just take them out there, pry this open, and then it eventually cracks open. And internally, you know what, this engine isn't too bad. It's done 110,000 kilometers, and I'm actually quite surprised in how good the crank bearings look and the overall condition of this. Not as good as the other 650, so I'll probably swap some parts out. But again, here's the rattle, this chain here, the primary chain, I definitely need to do something with. So look, this probably looks like a complete mess that I've just got stuff laying around everywhere. And from here, I will tidy this up, clean it up properly, and I'll do a much more detailed video on how this goes back together. Stay tuned.